Hi, and welcome to cookwithtom.com. Today we're going to be doing a master's class on artisan bread making. The challenge we've got to overcome today is we'll be doing a 90% saturation. Now what this means is we're essentially trying to make a loaf of bread out of pancake batter. Our bread is going to end up being a Fococcia bread we'll be serving later at a family dinner being held at the cookwithtom.com family members. The biggest challenge here is we've got to make sure that we keep our hands extra greasy. We keep our bowls extra greasy when it's time. But above and beyond that, it's actually pretty simple once you get the basics. As with all our bread recipes, the first step is combining water, sugar, and yeast. In this particular recipe, it's 1 cup water, 1.5 teaspoons of yeast, and 1.5 teaspoons of sugar. As you can see, when you put them all together, the yeast immediately goes to the bottom. What's happening is the water is dissolving the outer shell of the yeast, and the yeast is then going out looking for something to eat on. What we'll watch for is when the yeast starts to rise to the top, that's a good indication that our yeast is ready to go. While the yeast is dissolving, we're going to get the ingredients for our next step ready. 3 cups of flour, 2/3 of a cup of American beer, and 1¼ teaspoons of salt. We're starting to see some of the yeast rising to the top, as you can see here. We're going to let this go for a little bit longer until this yeast is good and frothy. I get the question a lot, why I use beer in my bread. The simple answer is that during the fermentation process, when the yeast is in contact with the wort, or barley tea if you will, it produces flavors you can't normally get in the bread making process, but that really add a richness to the bread. If you're worried about alcohol, believe it or not, the amount of alcohol produced by the yeast in this bread process is more than the amount of alcohol in the beer, and it all bakes off in the end. Now that the yeast has had about 10 minutes to proof, to the bowl we'll add 3 cups of flour. Now it's important to use a flour that is high in protein, all-purpose flour or bread flour. At least 4 grams of protein per 30 grams of flour. You can look on the side of the package, it'll tell you what the amount of protein is. The reason this is important, particularly in this recipe, is because we're using so much water. The glutens in the protein need something to bind to. If you don't have a high protein content in the flour, then it's not going to have enough glutens to be made in order to give the dough structure. So again, get the highest protein content. You might even want to consider using a bread flour. For this particular recipe, I'm using one that's 4 grams of protein for every 30 grams of flour. To the 3 cups of flour, we'll add good old American lager, 2/3 of a cup. And to that, we'll add our old friend salt. If you've seen some of the other shows on our site, there's questions about when to add the salt to the dough. In this particular recipe, because structure is important, we're going to add it after the flour, after the beer, and well after we've proofed the yeast. This way, it's not going to degrade the structure of the bread. Very important when you're working with 90% saturation. Once we've got all our ingredients in the bowl, attach it to the stand mixer. This is important because there's no way you're going to be able to knead this with your hands. Put on a dough hook and let it go for about 6 to 10 minutes. What we're looking for is the dough to start to turn glossy and pull away from the sides as it mixes. Ordinarily, I'll proof the bread in its traditional bowl. However, because of the high moisture content, it's going to be a lot easier to proof it in a different bowl. The reason being is we can add some oil to the bowl. We're going to add a tablespoon of olive oil. Then use our spatula to spread the oil around the bowl. This does 2 things. It coats the bowl, but it also coats the spatula. So when we take the bread off out of the bowl, which I've got hidden off camera here, so that when we take the bread, we actually turn it into the oiled pan. That keeps the dough from sticking as it rises. It also actually adds a little nice flavor of the olive oil to the bread. Once we've got all the bread dough out, which again, this stuff is sticky. Once we've got it all out, Once we've got it all out and into our pan, we'll get rid of the spatula and then add another tablespoon of olive oil over the top of the dough. And then turn the dough so that all the outsides are coated. This way, as it rises, it's not going to stick to the side of your bowl. We're ready to let this sit. We're going to want to let this sit for 2 to 3 hours because of the high moisture content. We want to give the glutens as much chance to work as possible. Ordinarily, you would cover this with a damp cloth, but because of the high moisture content, we're going to use regular old plastic wrap. We'll take this, we'll stick it in a draft-free warm area. You can use the proof box method we've used in other episodes. It's just easy, just find a nice draft-free warm area. 2.5 hours later, the dough has 2.5 times its size, and I gotta tell you, this is one of the most bubbly doughs you'll see. What we're gonna do now is heat our oven to 450 degrees and transfer this to a baking stone. I've already put parchment paper over the top of the baking stone. Remember, parchment paper is coated in silicone, wax paper is coated in wax. Typically, the silicone in the parchment paper is enough so that you don't have to add any other sort of oils. But just to be safe, again, we're dealing with a very, very sticky dough. I like to take and coat the top of the parchment paper with just a little bit of olive oil. Spread that around a little bit. Some people do this on the stone. I don't like to do that because if you're cooking at high heat, over time what happens is that oil, particularly if you're using olive oil with a lower smoke point, will cause your baking stone to turn black, and it just doesn't look good. And so I'll put the olive oil on the parchment paper. It's a good thing we put olive oil both on the bowl and the top of this yeast, it's a good thing we put olive oil around the bowl and on the top of the dough because this stuff is so sticky that it will not come out of the bowl. What we're going to do is we're going to take it and dump it directly on over the top of the pizza stone. Ordinarily I would preheat the stone, but I want to let this rise while the oven is heating to 450 degrees. To turn it over, the easiest way is to get a greased rubber spatula. I don't have time for that, so I'm just going to pour it directly onto the stone. You'll see it comes out in one big mass. When you do this, make sure you guide it so that it stays on the stone. And try to form a nice circle. This stuff is so sticky. If you do have a bread pan, you put it into a bread pan, let it rise for about 30 minutes. That also is an option. Baguette pan, French bread pan.